afternoon and welcome to the latest installment of the Adam Smith Society's virtual programming series. I'm Greg Mencken, the Executive Director of the Adam Smith Society, and I'd like to wish everyone on the conference today continued safety and well-being during these very difficult times. The mission of the Adam Smith Society to promote discussion around the benefits of free enterprise remains as important as ever. We will continue to offer opportunities so everyone can hear from leading experts online, and we of course look forward to the time when we can all meet in person once again. So thanks for joining us today to get in your weekly Smith Sock Fix. If you're not already a member of the Adam Smith Society and would like to learn more, please visit us at adamsmithsociety.com. Joining us today is Professor of Entrepreneurship at the MIT Sloan School of Management, Simon Johnson, to discuss policy and innovation in response to the coronavirus. Professor Johnson recently co-founded the COVID-19 Policy Alliance to rapidly develop, vet, and deliver policy proposals to combat the coronavirus. He co-founded the Global Entrepreneurship Lab course at MIT and has helped more than 500 projects with startups around the world. His many articles have appeared in just about every major news publication you can think of, and he is the former chief economist at the International Monetary Fund. You can follow Professor Johnson on Twitter at BaselineScene and learn more about the Policy Alliance at covidalliance.com. The professor will give about a 10 to 15 minute opening briefing, followed by audience Q&A, and finally, closing comments from the professor. Please note this conference is being recorded. You may ask questions in the question box in your GoToWebinar controls. Questions will be read aloud to the group by my colleague, Dean Ball. Please keep your questions and comments brief and state your name and chapter affiliation to ask a question. We'll get to as many as possible. You don't have to wait until the end of the professor's opening briefing to ask a question. You may submit a question at any time. And at this point, Professor, the floor, or should I say the screen is yours. Thanks so much for joining us today, Professor.
Thanks, Greg. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I think this is an interesting and actually important moment to discuss the role of free enterprise and the role of free enterprise in what I would suggest we call from now on the post-virus world. And I have three things I'd like to say in my opening remarks, and I'm looking forward to your questions, and I have a slightly longer term set of ideas to lay before you towards the end. The first point is about innovation in this difficult phase. The virus has manifested itself obviously a couple of months ago, but the extent to which it was going to hit and change the United States has been clear only for, let's say, approximately a month. And I think that I've worked in a lot of crises. My career over 35 years has involved working in most of the major systemic disasters around the world in different kinds of countries and different kinds of institutional settings. As Greg mentioned, I was the chief economist of the IMF 2007-2008, and after that crisis, I spent 3 years on the outside working on an intense daily basis on issues related to that crisis. I think this pandemic has some features that I'll return to that certainly are reminiscent or echoes of other crises we've seen in recent decades. It also does, frankly, have some fairly unique features, particularly the ways in which it is damaging health, obviously, but the way in which it's responding effectively requires a combination of science and technology, and I would say organization, or you could say management, and I would certainly emphasize free enterprise, by the way, as part of the solutions. This is not something we've seen in other financial crises, whether they were the global financial crisis or Asian financial crisis or collapse of the Soviet Union. I think that this is quite new. Now, we need innovation. We need to invent things. We need to find solutions that to technical problems, and we need to find solutions to more broader social issues, like, for example, reopening the economy, which I think we can agree is on everyone's mind right about now. The second point, though, is that innovation, inventing things, is quite difficult in this kind of crisis. Actually, it's difficult in any crisis. I mean, when the exchange rate's collapsing, when you've got runaway inflation, when you can't make your payments to the IMF, those are all other kinds of crises, financial and economic crises, as you know. In such situations, it's quite hard for firms and individuals to be innovative. I think in today's situation, it's even more difficult for a couple of reasons. One is the pace of events is much faster than in just about any other crisis that I or anyone else can recall. And that's because the virus moves at an exponential pace. So I think we have two kinds of forces in our world, typically. One is arithmetic forces. So I work at MIT. I'm only representing myself, by the way, today and in our COVID-19 Policy Alliance. Not at MIT officially, but a place like MIT, very well-run place, does well in good times. You add 10 faculty members, or you add a department. I mean, we recently added the College of Computing, which I'll come back to. These are additive arithmetic forces, I would say. Now, we do have some multiplicative forces. Multiplicative forces would include tech startups that could be 10 times bigger today than they were a year ago. And sometimes in these economic and financial crises, you can mobilize resources, you can pull the international community together. And, in April 2009, for example, there was a meeting of the G20 in London where the summit sort of pulled the best thinking together about fiscal policy in particular. And people who were there and people who observed that, including myself, said, oh, wow, this is big. This is maybe a 5 or 10 times improvement over what we thought before. So that's a multiplicative response. But the enemy in this case, as you know, is not additive, certainly, and it's not even multiplicative, it's exponential. So if the virus gets inside a nursing home, and my group spends a lot of time working with nursing home associations and people trying to protect the workers and residents of nursing homes, if the virus gets inside, then it spreads through that facility at an alarmingly fast rate, which roughly speaking, we could say is exponential. Something along the lines of 1 person the first day, 2 people the next day, 4 people the day after that. Now, you're not going to beat an exponential enemy with arithmetic forces or multiplicative forces. I mean, I think that's pretty clear to many of you already. What you need is a vast, very fast effort in which you go 24/7, because that's what the virus does, and that's what we do in our organization. You have to propose ideas, see if they work, decide if they're success or failure, and then do it again very quickly. I call those compute cycles. You need to have, well, when we started this more than a month ago, we were running 3 or 4 compute cycles a day, which is unbelievably fast and not something that even we can sustain. Today, we try to do 2 or 3 compute cycles in a 24-hour period, which is already pretty quick. Most existing organizations can't do that. Most established, reputable, well-organized innovation machines, could be MIT, could be a tech startup, it could be a large international company that has a lot of innovative capacity, for example, around biopharmaceutical, obviously very important right now. They don't move that fast. They move at their own speed, their own organizational speed. When I go to them, and I go to all of these people now, and I say, look, we need to speed it up, we need to drive this. Many times people say, well, that's a really important idea, Simon. Yes, we absolutely agree. And we'll get back to you on Tuesday. This is a Friday. And I'm like, guys, the virus isn't stopping. We need to make big dramatic changes. And another thing they'll say to me is, and I mean, I'm paraphrasing exact conversations, just disguising the details, so you don't know you can't track back who it was. Very distinguished person, brilliant scientist, head of a major organization. When I described to him what we were doing, our focus on nursing homes, our focus on trying to prevent the virus from getting inside nursing homes, assisted living, and so on, and essentially also using the tools of free enterprise to support the most vulnerable people in our society. And we were doing this before the lockdown in order to prevent the lockdown. But what this brilliant scientist said to me is, Simon, this is great, really good, you should do it. But we in this organization have our swim lanes. And our swim lanes, this particular person, our swim lanes are ventilators, testing, and vaccines. So we're going to stay in our swim lanes, and we can't help you, even though what you're doing is obviously complementary to what we're doing in our swim lanes. Well, what I've learned, I have to say, guys, over the past month is if you want to be effective in this post-virus world, many people need to get out of the swim lanes. Now, not everyone, okay? Not people doing biopharmaceutical research, absolutely. If you have a rapid antigen test, or if you're working on serological blood tests for antibodies, by all means, stick to it. I think picking up the pace would be a good idea. But personally, I'm an economist. I've worked on macroeconomics, I've worked on finance. I am so far out of my swim lanes, I can't even see the swimming pool. Here's the key, here's the thought. Things that made you efficient and things that made you innovative in the good times, in the relatively stable times, may well impede your ability to update, adapt, and reposition your capabilities to deal with the emergency. My co-chair of the COVID-19 Policy Alliance is one of my colleagues at MIT Sloan. His name is Retsef Levi. And Retsef, I think, has had a number of really crucial insights that have guided us through this period. One of which is that this is not an emergency in the sense of a temporary, transitory, and somewhat marginal effect. I mean, if you read Adam Smith, for example, Wealth of Nations, there's not much in there about emergencies. And I think you can say, Smith obviously was the father of much of modern economic thinking, and he's about equilibrium. He's about how things are going to go most of the time. Now, there are people who study economics of crises. I'm one of them. It's a little bit off to the side from the main thrust of economic research. Well, I would suggest to you that the post-virus world is quite different. The post-virus world is one in which the emergency is the dominant issue, and organizing around the emergencies, making yourself resilient, doing it in a way that's not too costly, doing it in a way you can sustain, that becomes the central economic, political, business question. Of course, Adam Smith was writing at a time when infectious disease was all around. In the late 18th century, many people died of infection, but from let's say the late 18th century, the first inoculation in smallpox until the eradication of smallpox, which was almost 200 years later, infectious disease was big and it was important, but it was declining. Random mass death, my friends, now stalks the earth again. This wasn't the first coronavirus, so why should it be the last? And this coronavirus derives its evil superpower from a profiling that you're now very familiar with, that many people can catch it, many people can transmit it, but only a few people, relatively few people will die. They're older people and people who already have underlying so-called comorbidities. But the next coronavirus, I would suggest, might profile in a different way. What if the next coronavirus profiles young people like yourselves? What if the next coronavirus profiles children? Now, once you've had that thought, I think you'll agree that we need to reposition, move a lot of our innovative capacity, both in the short term towards limiting the human impact and managing a more orderly exit from the lockdowns, which I believe is completely within our capabilities over the coming weeks, perhaps 1 month, perhaps a month and a half, depending how long it takes us to get organized. And subsequently, we need to build resilience with innovation. So there's a short-term piece, and I'll come back to the longer-term pivot for innovation going forward. But here's the interesting thought. Well, I would suggest actually it's more than a thought at this point. It's an empirical observation, which is both existing private sector enterprises, some of the most efficient companies in the world, the most innovative companies in the world, are struggling to make that pivot. And also of interest, although I understand that this audience may be more skeptical of government than many audiences, but yeah, what do you know? It turns out that the federal government in this environment is really struggling to build the systems necessary to reopen the economy. I think they've made, roughly speaking, zero progress so far. That's a strong statement, but we can go through it in the Q&A if you want. The states have come up with a few pieces, but not enough to securely, robustly reopen the economy and keep it open. So who is building those systems? The private sector. I mean, I'm not claiming that my group is going to save the world, don't get me wrong, but we're helping people and working with people who've got solutions, who are on massively convergent paths and who are driving towards automated contact tracing, for example, driving towards better testing and at scale, right? What is scale of testing? It's not 10,000 or 100,000 tests a day. I can assure you that in the United States. It's the capability to deploy millions of tests per day effectively. That's how you get ahead of this. That's how you beat it. Right? So there's a bunch of big conceptual shifts. Government will, I believe, my current thinking will get there, but the private sector will lead. So this is a triumph for free enterprise. Yes, I would agree it is. I think it's a different form of private enterprise. The people I work with are all volunteers. Nobody's trying to make money. When this is over, we'll go back to whatever it is we were doing before. I think you have to move fast. I think you want to be you can do what you want, obviously. I recommend that you consider the role of catalyst, because I find that a lot of people like yourselves are problem solvers. And what the world needs right now is problem solvers. And so what do I mean by that? Find people who are working on what you regard as important COVID-19 issues. It could be people who are trying to run food banks at scale, given the economic crisis we're facing. It could be people who are trying to run clinical trials. It could be people who are just trying to help nursing homes and assisted living. And then we're involved with people who are doing all of those things in our alliance. Find out, listen to them carefully. Do not come with any preconceptions. You can come with a sense of what's important and what matters to you, that's fine. But in terms of the detailed specific problems, I think it's just as we teach in entrepreneurship classes, find the end user, listen to them carefully, and when you think you have a solution, say to them, look, if I did this and this, would that help you? And if they say no, then think of something else, right? Find the end user, find some proposed solutions. If they say no, don't do it. If they say yes, then do it, and then figure out quickly, is this the right thing? How do we drill down, and so on. It is very entrepreneurial in its nature, I would say, the solution I'm proposing to you and what you can do. And that's why I think it will appeal to you, frankly. But it's also, keep in mind, it's a lot faster than standard entrepreneurship. It's a lot faster. It's a lot more chaotic, probably. Figuring out who's on your side, who's not on your side is important. You need to move fast. You need to stand up resources. That's what I call it when I call people and say, we're doing this, I need you to help me. And if they stand with you, then you work with them. And if they don't, you move on. And never, ever, I would suggest, any hard feelings in the post-virus world. I honestly believe, guys, that everyone will get to where we're getting and where I'm sure many of you are getting eventually. But, it takes time. Big organizations don't pivot easily. Governments have, as you understand, their own particular set of issues. So I think what we need is the private sector, free enterprise, very broadly defined. And actually, to be honest, with all due respect to Adam Smith, a bit broader than Adam Smith, because it's the for-profit free enterprise part, plus it's the voluntarism part, plus it's what we know about structuring these efforts and bundling them together. And of course, we also have at our disposal, at least in principle, a lot more science, a lot more technology than Adam Smith, frankly, could ever imagine. I mean, Smith, remember, saw glimpses, and he saw them very clearly, but he saw glimpses of the beginnings of the factory age. So we've done the factory age, we've done the post-factory age, we're in the information age, I think we're in the Zoom age, frankly, where, I can spend 16 hours a day in front of my Zoom account working on stuff with people all around the world, and it doesn't matter that we're not in the same room. I'm working with people intensely. I've never met in person. I might never meet them in person. We'll see what happens, right? So I think it's a different world, different forces, different pressures. But the Adam Smith insight that you need to figure out what you're doing relative to other people, you need to look for that complementarity division of labor. You need to understand that system and work within that system. Absolutely profoundly right. I'm going to add voluntarism, and I'm going to add, the hard work of lots of people. The people who work hardest in our organization, people who can sustain the hard work, many of them have jobs, other jobs, other full-time jobs, which is not exactly what Adam Smith would have suggested. But, I think that's fine. I think the world has changed. I think we're moving on. I think the spirit of free enterprise, thank goodness, is alive and kicking in the United States. And I'm hoping that all of you will be interested and inspired to work with us or create your own organizations and build your own efforts, catalyzing, helping people who are trying to innovate solutions that we need to beat back this coronavirus, reopen the economy, and ensure this never, under any circumstances, happens to us again, either from this coronavirus, a future coronavirus, or any kind of shock that could hit the world and hit this country. So with that, I'll pause and happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Professor. We really appreciate that. So I would like to invite everyone at this time to submit your questions via the question box in your GoToWebinar controls. Please remember to state your name and your chapter affiliation, and we'll get to as many questions as possible. I would like to kick things off here by being a little bit more forward-looking. Professor, you talked a lot about the importance of innovation. What can the private sector do once Corona passes to set itself up to be even more responsive and even more nimble the next time something like this happens? Have you had a chance to get any of those kind of key insights yet, or is that still kind of something that you're examining?
Well, it's a great question, Greg, and it's certainly early days. So let's be quite clear and honest with each other about that. I do think that nimbleness, or I think the word I like is, it's actually the word that you hear a lot when you talk to people in Germany right now. The word is resilience. And so the question is, how do you design your own systems and think about the fallback plans so that you can be resilient to both the obvious shocks and also quickly adapt and respond to new shocks? So there's a major bank, for example, that I know that has divided its work teams, at least for some of their products, into two. Let's call them green and blue. And the green and blue teams work together, including in person, but they mustn't meet each other ever. So in other words, they created something of a segmentation of their workforce to reduce the chance that both teams would get knocked out by the disease right away. So that's an improvisation. I'm sure it's not perfect, but that's a kind of structural thinking about how firms can organize themselves that's relatively sensible in this environment. Similarly, understanding and thinking about who can work remotely and when. So the biotech firms that we're working with, some of them have, well, many of them have maintained a policy and have permission for the lab workers, the bench scientists, to come to work because they can't otherwise be productive. But a lot of the admin, finance people, the other functions can stay home because honestly, while they might like to come to the office and meet people in person, they can do just fine for days, weeks, or months with remote linkages. So I think thinking about resilience and thinking through what works, when, how do we stay productive in the emergency becomes a lot more important. And I think we have to move beyond this, long-standing notion that emergencies are rare. A hurricane might hit us every 10 years or something, or, earthquakes might come, but they're not, for the most part, not such a big deal. I think you have to understand that we're now living in a world, the post-virus world, in which the emergencies are key issues around which we need to structure our society and our economy.
Neil from our New York City chapter is wondering about the government reaction to this so far has involved a large new role for the state in many different parts of the economy. And he's wondering about the long-term ramifications of that. Do you think it will be difficult for the government to retreat from its position of overarching authority? And do you think that could dampen the spirit of free enterprise down the road?
Well, I think that's a very fair question, and obviously it will depend on to what extent the private sector is damaged. I mean, I'm very concerned, for example, about the way small business has been treated, or I would suggest mistreated, by government authority in this entire situation. Now, if we're able to reopen the economy, small business comes back and prospers, perhaps that concern will recede. But I think if we reopen and then have to close again, and small business takes big hits in 6 months, I think a lot of those entrepreneurs are going to say, well, I'm just going to sit on the sidelines and protect my capital and not risk my workers. So in that case, if the private sector is more damaged, then the public sector will get drawn. I would agree with you, would get drawn into more activities. And I think, while I do envisage some really important strategic investments by the public sector, I'll talk about those in a few minutes, I would emphasize that it's the complementarity between what the public sector does and what the private sector can do, has done, will do. That's the key to prosperity in this country and in many other countries. So I share Neil's apprehension. I'm not yet willing to say that the government has taken over and will never get back private economy. I mean, I think, frankly, guys, again, from 35 years of systemic crises, there are moments when the private sector is so damaged that you want the government to step in and pay people money or do other things. Most of the innovation that I meet, most of the people who want sensible change in the moment and longer term right now are private sector people. Most of them are, many of them are some kind of entrepreneur, although larger firms have entrepreneurial people in them too. So I wouldn't want to be too categorical about that. So I think private enterprise will be back now, I hope.
Thank you. Edwin from our MIT chapter is curious to know what principles should we keep in mind as we restart economies across the world and regionally across the United States?
Yeah, I think, Edwin, the first most important thing is not to kill people. I mean, people die of natural causes every day in the United States. I don't think we're about abolishing death. But I think when you have clusters of infection, a lot of people get sick at the same time, and that causes hospitals to be overloaded and overwhelmed, that's a problem that has many, many negative consequences. So finding ways to reasonably and responsibly reopen, I think that is absolutely number one. And then I think the key, Edwin, is to stay open. Because if you reopen and then close, as I said a moment ago, you're going to further disrupt and even destroy small business. And maybe some larger businesses also get into trouble. You're introducing a level of volatility into the economy that is quite hard to price and quite hard to overcome through standard mechanisms. And best case, the government end up doing more things. But as we already said in the discussion or response to the question from Neil, that's not such a good outcome. So I think that opening responsibly, doing it carefully, staying open, and the virologists, the ones I talk to anyway, are quite convinced that there will be repeated rounds of either reinfection or potential reinfection. So people will be scared later this year and maybe even during the winter. So I think we need to work on that. We need to plan. We need to have strategies. And I do think also that you should not leave this to the federal government. once again, I don't believe the government is going to play that constructive role. So I'm working with people in the private sector, companies, universities, schools, others, who are trying to make their own reopening plan. Now, at some level, your local authority, the mayor or the governor, does have a decisive say. But if the mayors and governors are more convinced that more of the private sector has set things up to be responsible and to be able to react quickly if, for example, the infection rate rises, then I think that the local government officials will be more confident about staying open. So there's a bit of a public-private balance at the local level. But in any case, my main point is, if the private sector builds it, the government will eventually get there.
Matt from our Washington, D.C. professional chapter asks, what do you see as the principal technology needs or opportunities in the market right now that have been created by COVID but are not already being addressed by the health tech industry?
Well, that's interesting, Matt. I mean, I think in some ways the most obvious, the most pressing needs are also quite obvious and fully understood, but they're still not happening, right? So I think we need testing at scale, like mass millions a day. The industry believes, and I think the federal government has unfortunately contributed to this misapprehension, that testing at its current level, which is about 100,000 a day, is somehow going to be the basis for successful reopening and resilient staying open. I think that I wouldn't wait for the government to come to a sense on that. I think we need to build a lot more testing capacity. We also need to integrate that testing with a contact tracing system. Now, the good news there is that another group at MIT, headed by Ron Rivest and Danny Weinstein, has something called PACT, P-A-C-T. You can see it at pact.mit.edu. Nothing to do with me, full disclosure, but I like it. It's automated contact tracing, and it's opt-in. There will be an API available by the end of this month, I'm told, and Apple and Google have agreed to upgrade their operating systems at some point, perhaps if we're lucky in May, that will make it even easier to opt in. So this is using technology in sensible ways, and maybe you can say it's creating a platform for contact tracing. But I think there's other things that can be done, Matt, on top of that, with that, complementary to that. And I'm personally hoping that there's going to be a lot of innovation around the idea that people want to be safer, people want to understand where they've been, they want to understand where they are relative to hotspots. So information systems and intelligence systems about where is the disease, what's its exact nature, is it coming towards me or going away from me? That's something that we work on. We have a public-facing part of that work using publicly available data at covidalliance.com, but we also work with private parties, mostly, well, some commercial, actually, to be frank, who give us the data for free, and some non-commercial, like governments or associations that also give us access to the data for free. In return, everybody wants to get a more integrated, clearer look at where is the disease geographically and where is it mathematically. Is it coming at me really fast? Do I need to lock down? Do I need to get ready? Or is something that's something of a slightly safer distance, and I could, for example, take some partial distancing measures to reduce the potential that I will suffer some sort of cataclysmic health shock. So I think that it's passing that data and building on these systems that are coming, Matt, which I would describe as being platforms or layers on which we and hopefully you guys can also build.
Greg from our New York City professional chapter asks, given the complexity of the crisis, to what extent do you think solutions or improvement will come outside the traditional channels of government, academia, and the venture capital community?
Yeah, so I agree. It's about complexity, Greg. It's also about the speed, and it's also about the fact that, frankly, no one in this country was really ready for this, including myself, let's be clear. And that's why it's a crisis, right? It's a crisis, a big crisis when everyone is taken by surprise, which is what happened in 2007, 2008. Although, frankly, I was working at the IMF then, we tracked it very carefully. We were surprised in, early or mid 2007. By the time we came to September 2008, we understood a lot about what was happening and what was going to happen. I think this pandemic took people much more profoundly by surprise. It's because it's exponential. It's moved a lot faster. I do think that outsiders, let's say people who are outside their swim lanes, like myself, and my organization, the people I work with, have a role to play, particularly as catalysts. But I also feel that established players in their swim lanes, people who are working on new tests for serology, for example. So tests for antibodies, whether or not you're immune whether you've had COVID-19 and now immune. And those people they should do what they've been doing. And the rest of us should figure out how to organize pieces around that, waiting for that, integrating with that. I think that's very, very healthy and very sensible. So I think the answer to your question, Greg, is it's a combination of inside and outside. And the inside forces are immensely powerful and very capable in this country, but they need to be somewhat recombined and they need to pivot. And they know this. I mean, they're smart people, I think, at this point. Nothing I'm saying to you is particularly surprising to people who are on the front lines of innovation at this moment. But it doesn't mean that's easy, right? Particularly the higher your reputation, the better your position in the pre-virus world. I often find those people have the hardest time adapting to the new realities, which is, I think, where you were going with your question, Greg.
Our last question before Professor Johnson's closing remarks comes from Philip from our University of Chicago chapter. How large would you say the cost would be of having a flexible or more resilient economy in the long term? Would it result in slower growth? Other costs we're not thinking about? How should we think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, Philip. My response, and obviously it needs more work, clearly, right? We're still very early. But my thought is it doesn't cost as much at all if we do it right. So who has been less affected by this? Well, Singapore. Singapore is a high-income country. It has a lot of efficiently run activities. They, to date, okay, we're not out of the woods yet, but to date, the shock there has been relatively minimal. Now, the state has a relatively strong and maybe even unique role in Singapore, but South Korea was also able to, despite being quite infected for a moment, they were surprised by how some of the infection spread. They were able to respond and they were able to redeploy assets and catch up with it. So I think that those economies are not ones that I associate with, impediments to growth due to investments in resilience. And I'm certainly not saying that, you should have, restricted government rules, for example, that would limit what people are allowed to do in terms of investments, and that will necessarily, lead to more resilience. No, I think resilience comes from a private sector that can move quickly, that is prepared, that has a pandemic response industry, if you like. But learning ourselves to pandemics would probably be a failure of imagination also. So shocks of all kinds, we need to take those on board, and we need to think about positioning for those. I think that building a large stockpile of N95 masks in any country is not likely to be a good idea, because the masks will probably expire before you need them. Building and encouraging people to build companies where they can switch from producing one kind of fabric to producing N95 masks quite quickly, well, that's an interesting idea, and it's not clear to me that you necessarily lose anything from having that kind of capability. So I think resilience will become much more of a common investment, much more of a valued investment. How does that actually play out through the stock market and through returns on capital? Very interesting question. Is there a role for tax policy, for example, to reflect the fact there are externalities, positive externalities? Also an idea that is derived from Smith, at least indirectly. If there are positive externalities because you're building resilience into your systems, should we reward that with a lower tax rate, for example? Good question. I can certainly see how part of the debate might well head in that direction.
Well, Professor, thank you so much. I know you wanted to offer some concluding remarks, so I would invite you to do that now.
Thank you, Craig. Yeah, so I think once we're out of this phase, and this phase I think is a relatively long and relatively painful one, but we will come out of it. I think we need to look ahead and to think about what kind of economy do we want to have, what kind of society do we want to be, and what's our role in the world. And I would just remind everyone that in World War II, because of the threats faced by the United States, there was a conscious decision taken at the highest levels of the country to build a much stronger science and technology capability. And this, for example, was used to develop radar and also the atomic bomb and other numerous innovations that were used in the war. At the end of World War II, there was a famous report written by Vannevar Bush and his colleagues. Bush was the head of this wartime scientific effort. The report was called The Endless Frontier. Science, the Endless Frontier, which is, yes, absolutely, he anticipated Star Trek, he did, really. And Bush argued, I think correctly, absolutely correctly in retrospect, that while during World War II, the country had done better because it had been able to deploy existing scientific capabilities, including physicists who were deployed from various kinds of work to radar and to the atomic bomb, Bush argued that if you want to succeed more broadly in the world, you need to invest more in science and create new scientific knowledge and new capability. I think that's absolutely right. And I wrote a book with John Gruber that came out a year ago called Jumpstarting America, in which we took that argument and we applied it obviously in what was then a relatively full employment America. And we said, if you want more productivity growth, if you want more opportunity, you should have larger public sector commitment to science, but do that in a way that facilitates, encourages, and catalyzes private sector investments in commercialization and building products. So it's a public sector, private sector complementarity. Now, I know, and I've heard your questions today, I know that there's sensitivity about the role of the public sector in this crisis, and I think I'm largely with you on that. The question is, what's the alternative? But I think as you go forward, thinking about what we invest in, where we invest, the scale of that investment. I mean, let me put it to you this way. Interest rates are basically zero. How much would any one of you be willing to invest today to substantially reduce the probability of a pandemic and a massive disruptive lockdown 4 years from now, 8 years from now, 20 years from now? Well, it's not an unlimited amount, surely, but it is a lot because the cost of this destruction are far, far in excess of what John Gruber and I proposed as a medium-term strategy. Now, to be clear, we were not predicting pandemic. We were not saying only invest in pandemic-related technology. But today, as I sit before you, I would say that should be the top priority item. I think that solves a lot of questions about what do you want to invest in, where do you need technology? Well, clearly, in the first instance, don't allow another coronavirus to do this to us. In the second instance, what other shocks are we aware of that could do this to us? And in the third instance, what else can we not imagine at all that would still cause problems for us? So investing in that kind of resilience, why have the public sector do it all? Well, we talk about this in the book. And the point is that, you know, even in our most private sector moments in this country, we have found that for science, where you're creating new knowledge that has a lot of spillovers across different activities, you need the public sector to do it, because the private sector, while it's good at many things, is not going to internalize those externalities. It just doesn't work that way. So take that thinking to today, or to as we come out of this crisis. I think it's big investments in science and technology, structure them so as to encourage and create or help create private enterprise, and spread that around the country. I think this idea that should just be a couple of poles of technology development, for example, on the East Coast and the West Coast, I think that idea belongs in the pre-virus world. In the post-virus world, we need to do a lot. We need to do it everywhere. We need to do it for ourselves. We need to do it for the world. I mean, the US is by far the most innovative country in terms of total innovative capacity the world has ever seen. So given that we're up against a global threat, given that this pandemic finds a way to race through the most vulnerable people and spread to everyone and damage all our economic activity, why not take this on as a US challenge and as a global challenge? And you know what? People will pay you for this technology. I'm not suggesting charity, not at all. I'm suggesting free enterprise and the kinds of motivations and incentives that Adam Smith himself observed and recommended. I'm suggesting that we take all of that and apply it in a modern form, surely, to the problems we face now in the post-virus world. Thank you very much.
Professor Johnson, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We really appreciate your time on the screen with us today, Professor. Appreciate that. Tune in again next week, Thursday, April 23rd, again at 1 p.m. Eastern, when we will hear from author and Professor Ryan Hanley on Adam Smith, Capitalism and the Good Life. It should be a nice change of pace that I'm sure we could all use right now. So we look forward to seeing you there. Check out our full upcoming lineup at adamsmithsociety.com on your screen there. And again, I want to wish everyone health and well-being, and have a wonderful day. Thanks so much.